You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Welcome to The Imaginable Workplace, where we explore how we make work better. I'm Carl Javier, CEO of Puma Podcast, an award-winning podcast production company that aims to spread the joy, power, and value there is in listening.
And I'm Jackie Cañiza, founder and managing partner of Haraya Coaching. Rooted in wholeness, Haraya supports individuals and teams by creating brave and safe spaces for transformation.
In this episode, we're thinking about productivity. And it's a hard thing to define and it's a hard thing to measure, but it's one of these really important concepts when we think about work. And I think productivity has been challenged because of the pandemic. And it has really challenged managers who used to be able to walk around and check if people were working. And that's where I think we start with the sense of, I need to see you to know that you're working. A person can walk around the factory and see if someone is doing their job when it is a mechanical task. But in this increasingly services and information-based work, how do we approach it? So I'm bringing in Jackie. Where do you start thinking about something like this? And before I hand it off to you, we're talking about this because someone actually brought up software that tracks what people are doing on their laptops during work hours.
Ooh, very big brother.
Yeah. So how do you feel about that first?
I am personally not a fan of surveillance. And maybe there are jobs.
Let's make
Where?
a quote card, Jackie Cañiza. I am personally not a fan of surveillance.
Maybe there are jobs or roles where that's necessary. I'm struggling now to think about where or when that might be appropriate.
I must
I
say
think-
never, but I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. The pandemic really did a lot to change our mindsets, I think, in determining how we should manage and monitor work of people.
Mhm.
In my team, we're very much virtual. We have an office space, but we barely use it. Maybe it's once a quarter, even less. All our meetings are online. We do face-to-face work when the clients require it of us. But for the most part, everyone's just working virtually. I can't imagine how I would have something to tell me what, say, Jen is doing today and every hour of the day. It's a strange thing to me.
Well,
What do you think about it?
I have the same feelings. Like I feel weird trying to look up what somebody is looking up. Because
Yeah.
one of the tracking software that I was told about was, for example, at random points in the work day or work night or whatever, it will just screen cap whatever the person is working on or whatever is on that
Whoa.
person's screen. It will just screen cap. So hindi siya necessarily the whole time, but it will screen cap.
Okay.
Boom.
Okay.
That's one. And then in an old job, as part of productivity, you start a task, you click a thing, and then you start working on it. So it's self-reported. But there's two words that you brought up that I want to dig into that connect to this sort of looking at how people are working. You said, how do I manage and monitor? And they seem to be related, but they're two very different things. Because to
Right.
manage someone is to give them guidance on what tasks they need to do, what's more urgent, what's important,
Yeah.
how do they effectively use their time. And then to monitor them is a totally different thing, which is to make sure that what you've told them to do is being done. And I think if you're a good manager working with a good employee, you don't need to monitor. You just need to manage. Yung monitoring will presuppose some things. Let's stay within the realm of your employees actually deliver. Kasi kung delinquent employees sila and stuff, that's a different conversation. But let's move from, if you know that the team delivers, would you need to monitor them?
I guess the question is, what is the purpose of the monitoring? Diba? Kasi if I'm wanting to know how things are going so that I can support, maybe provide resource or address hurdles or roadblocks, tasks as a manager, then maybe there's value in me monitoring. Does that make sense to you?
I see. So if you see that there's something they're struggling with, you can intervene
Yeah.
to provide support.
Or if they're doing something that is different and others could learn from it, then you also want to know how they're doing things more effectively or efficiently. So those are the opportunities that I see in actual monitoring of work. There's a difference between checking up on and checking in. If I'm checking up on your work, I'm simply wanting to know status, nagawa mo na ba or hindi, late ba, versus checking in. How are you doing with the work? What are you challenged with? What support do you need? What are you learning even? I think those are very different things. And I have a bias towards more checking in than checking up. I know when checking up might be valuable. Let's say you had a client report you were preparing and needed to report status. Then sure, do a bit of check up. But you can't not do a checking in, I think. That's much more valuable in my book.
I like that. Ako naman, I think I just have a different terminology that I picked up in my classes and stuff, which was follow-up mechanisms versus follow-through mechanism, where follow-up is the asa na tayo, asa na yung trabaho mo, ganyan. And then follow-through is basically yun, yung you set checkpoints so that the people can follow through on their commitments. And then they will present to you. Like, oh guys parang it's a difference of it's Monday, nasan ka na sa project? Tuesday, asan ka na? Ganyan. Versus, okay guys, these are the things that need to be accomplished. On Friday, you will present to me what's done. And then at any point in between, you can ask for interventions. We'll do a stand-up so you can stay accountable on those times versus the, where are we on this project? Where are we on this project? But I do think that begs the question, especially for managers. And yung enlighten me na lang if it's a little backward. But the way that I approach management is trying to optimize the work that my team is doing towards our goals. And so what that looks like is, for example, I assume that full-timers are committed to a 40-hour work week. And what that 40-hour work week actually looks like is 32 hours to 36 hours of optimal work. Because I know that if you take an 8-hour chunk of the day, syempre wala dyan yung lunch and they're gonna take a break and your brain is not functioning optimally the entire 8-hour day. But if someone can come to me with about 6 hours of work, then I'm good. At the same time, yung 6 hours is 6 hours worth of work, which is another thing that I think about. And that's sort of how I parcel out assigning work is, what would I expect someone to accomplish in this time? And then may variance yan depending on yung mga tao na mabilis magtrabaho and then titigil versus the ones who are consistently sat there and they're churning in small bits. So there's all of these different variables that come into play, but I think about making sure that they're doing optimal.
I understand the principle of it. I guess what I'm curious about is what's the reference for optimal work? Because you have this range of people who can do fast and people who can take their time. Do you take the average and use that as the reference point and then kind of have that as the standard for everybody else?
So this is a slight tangent, but you know how when you're a top performer, everything looks easy to you. And so it's hard for you to coach other people because it's just natural. That's why, as a sports example, Michael Jordan isn't a great coach. But when you look at a lot of the good coaches, they were role players as basketball players because they were making the most of what they were doing. And so I don't expect the superstar performance from everyone in everything. What we do is I sort of try and set a baseline. And honestly, the baseline, at least for Pumo Podcast tasks, is me. As someone who doesn't know most of the tasks, I will try to accomplish and set a baseline for what I can expect. And then baselining that against someone who's more skilled and less skilled. And one of the things actually that we think about is mental bandwidth. Because, and this is like another productivity conversation to be had, but nakakabit kasi sa mechanical movements yung 8-hour workday, right? And so
Yeah.
People were just like, pulling on a crank or whatever, in the assembly line for 8 hours, or nasa pabrika and doing this thing for 8 hours.
Yep.
But another thing that we factor in is the mental load that you can carry in a day. And what is the optimal mental load? So for us, we're storytellers. We are covering news stories or something like that. And so I say, how long does a story take? Maybe it depends on, meron pa kaming ratings. Story, level 1, level 2, level 3. And a level 1 story is one interviewee, very simple, versus level 2, multiple interviewees, versus level 3, deep dive story. And each of those has its own number of hours commensurate to the
Wow.
demand. So we break it down to that level so that on a week that you have a level 3 story, dapat yung level 3 story mo takes, I think we allot something like 16 hours on a level 3, which means that you're going to be assigned less of the other kinds. And so the time, and that's one thing we can interrogate, time as an arbitrary stand-in for what optimal work is. And then factoring in yung bandwidth na kaya ng utak ng tao bago siya mag-tap out. Because I'm sure we've all felt that, yung mental tap out.
Yeah.
My brain can't deal with this anymore. So I try to find the moment of hindi pa sila maxed out. Yung kaya pa ng kaunti, and then you let that rest so that you can keep going on the following day. Although I don't know how our producer Macy feels about all of these things I'm saying, if this is actually done properly in practice. But that's how I try and think about it.
Well, what I appreciate is that you're actually trying to use an objective, logical way of measuring and determining workload. You could very easily use an arbitrary number and, okay, here's the standard for everybody, right? My question then is, would you, if you had the standard of a number of hours, the quantity of output that someone will have in a day, do you feel a need to know what they're doing throughout the day, or do you just wait until the end of the day and they submit all of the stuff that they need to?
Magandang tanong yan. Because that's a thing that we often have disagreements about on the team.
Okay.
How responsive should you be?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the challenges of work from home, synchronous, asynchronous. Because we want to create the space for, I'm most inspired pag madilim, whatever, ganyan. Kailangan ko bumuelo, hindi ako makakatrabaho agad in the morning, hindi ako morning person, ganyan. And we want to create space for that. But that also means that some people wind up working in odd hours. But also, we are working at the quote-unquote time of business, which is the time of other companies. So it's a challenge for us to constantly figure out. But I think responsiveness is really, really important. And at the very least, we want people to say when they will be away from their computers. Like, I won't be able to reply from this time to this time because I'm doing this thing. And that allows for the flexibility, ideally. In a more realistic scenario, sometimes people don't say, or they didn't get up on time, or they lost internet and they weren't able to drop a message. But optimally, people are communicating and we're checking output. But also, minsan kailangan mo ng sagot eh. Minsan kailangan nakakasagot yung tao, and for me that's a really big problem when it's work hours and someone isn't replying to their chats and I need specific pieces of information.
What I'm taking away is there has to be very clear expectations set around, here's the output that I expect, and here's the response rate and communication channel that I expect for us to have open and when.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, because if you do all of those things, you don't need to surveil somebody.
Exactly.
If you're already agreed upon and the person agrees also.
Yeah.
Which is why I think about these monitoring and surveillance systems, because pwede namang hindi, but it requires two things. It requires more work on the side of the manager to set up systems and to constantly communicate how the work is done. And then the second is the trust. Because you're like, okay, guys, eto na. And then as a manager, you have to just sit back and then you wait and you hope. And I think that's the harder part for a lot of managers, is we have to wait and hope that it will come in. And I think that's a difficult thing to not surveil.
You use the word trust, which we've used before. So I think there's definitely a need for that. It's interesting because especially in these days, there are so many tools that can help you to see where people are at with projects, right? There's so many platforms that you can use. We use one in our team, and that's where
Project management.
Project management. Yeah, it projects get updated, questions are raised there, and communication channels for tasks are set up. So it already takes the place of the checking up. I think so. If there was enough use of technology, then a manager can focus their time and attention and energy on the more essential things, the checking in type of things.
When you said there are all of these tools for productivity, on the other side of it, ang naisip ko, there are all of these tools for surveillance.
There are, apparently.
And it's much easier to surveil people than it is to build out systems, huh?
So funny. So funny. Yeah. So the whole thing about trust, we've established well enough, right? We also talked about vulnerability before as a leader. And I think one key aspect that we can add to those two is this concept of accountability.
Right.
If we do have clear expectations, if we can agree on here are the metrics, here are the standards, here's the outcome of the work that I expect, then you can hold me accountable. We have an agreement of when and how often you deliver. And if I don't deliver to those standards, then I'm accountable. So I think those three things have to come together so that you have a level of efficiency in the workplace that doesn't require all of these surveillance things.
What I'm thinking is when you set up a work system and say you are not used to thinking about it the way that we are thinking about it now. First off, we acknowledge each industry, each line of work, each kind of work will have to adapt to all of this. There is no one size fits all model for how
absolutely.
best to work. But if someone were trying to move towards this, ayan, they have these guiding principles: trust, accountability, and vulnerability. But all of those take a lot of time. So I guess as we sort of finish out this episode, what are the first steps that a manager who is struggling to trust can take so that they can take these initial steps towards more output and systems-based productivity as opposed to surveillance-based productivity?
So learning from your examples earlier, I think the first question to be asking is, what are the outcomes that I expect? How will we define success for the different roles that are in the team? Because they might vary. That might include timelines, budgets, targets, customer expectations, quality, etc. And to make sure those are very, very clear. If those are clear, then you as a manager can also ask, what does support look like? So that can determine how often do we check in and what's the method for checking in? What does that look like for us? What would be helpful for the team?
I'm Carl Javier.
And I'm Jackie Cañiza. Thank you for listening to The Imaginable Workplace. This podcast is brought to you by Haraya Coaching, a company rooted in wholeness that supports individuals and teams by creating brave and safe spaces for transformation.
In partnership with Puma Podcast, an award-winning podcast production company that aims to spread the joy, power, and value there is in listening. This episode was produced by Macy Joven and Jen Horn and edited by Joe Salcedo.
If you appreciated this podcast, then we're sure you know someone else who'd also want to improve their workplace. So please share this with a colleague or friend and do give us a rating on your podcast app. It really helps get the word out about our work. And follow this show on your podcast app for more stories, data, and insights on creating your imaginable workplace.